Hello everyone, welcome back to the Journal of Ulfgar Holderheck. In this chapter, we will be going into the Durst basement, which is a labyrinth that players sometimes find themselves in. When I was told about the death house by other people, I had more than one person tell me that one of our party would probably die before it's over, and I was worried. Um, I'd also like to take a moment to remind you that this module that you can play and run yourself is available at any time in your bookstore or D&D Beyond. I'm not supported by Dungeons and Dragons. This is just for fun. But if you don't want spoilers, I advise you not listen on. Every single DM will run this differently. Wow. So if you're thinking about running this, stick around. My DM had a multitude of wonderful ideas, which he executed perfectly. I've never looked at the module. I don't know what's in it. I don't know what he added. I don't know what he took out. So your experience will be different 100%. In this section, I must warn you again that this contains violence and descriptions that you may find graphic. Thank you for listening and your continued support. Now, without further hesitation, let's delve into Chapter 3, The Bowels of the Durst Manor. We descended the stairs. I led in the front with Gunner in the back. Our weapons were drawn, eyes straining against the ever-growing darkness. The air was cold and dry, but there was a scent of something else, something unsettling that none of us could describe. At the base of the stairs, there was a tunnel that opened up. "Do you hear that?" Atharath asked. Straining our ears, we could hear chanting. The syllables would repeat, but it was muffled and far away. We could not discern the words, but the meaning was ill and vile. We ventured further through the dark tunnels until we came to a room made of stone. A room that was supposed to be her. The Durst family crypt. We found stone slabs that were meant to seal these crypts leaning against the farthest wall. Their names were etched onto each of them. Gustav, Elizabeth, Porter Rose and Thorn, and even the missing baby Walter. Each of the crypts were empty. Where there was supposed to be a stone wall on the other side, someone had carved away the rock and tunneled through the earth. There were thick support beams running the length of the tunnel. What we found on the other side was a room that mirrored that of the dining hall above us. There was a single table that stretched out the length of the room. The table was strong, made from wood that hadn't succumbed to the dampness that seemed to glisten on the earthen walls in the torchlight. There were wooden plates on the table, but instead of normal utensils, there were jagged daggers and large spiked tools that looked more for butchering than eating. Cassius had looked at the bones in the table and was expecting the ones on the floor. Though they were all old, he deduced that he could see teeth marks that they were gnawed upon. And though he was a man that didn't show much emotion, we could see the horror come over his face. "These are human remains," he whispered. Cannibalism. This cult had committed one of the highest atrocities known to me or anyone that I have known. There wasn't anyone in their right mind who would willingly slaughter and devour other humanoids. This evil, it ran deep, and it had tainted everything and anything good that could have been here. To me, that meant Rose and Thorn must have perished early in the corruption of the house, before whatever happened down here had happened. They seemed to carry no ill will and were more scared than anything. We went through another opening and found a room with another table, much smaller, for meetings. And in the corners there were personal spaces with narrow frame beds and straw molded and gathered in pieces in the floor. Before we could do anything, the smell that had been at the edge of our senses grew and grew, and through the dark door, a shambling form of undead cultists stepped into the room. Their skin had all but gone, and the muscles atrophied, causing their movements to be stiff. But I could not see, more and more of them poured out. I could not see what or who they were. There were 6 of them, and they were still dangerous. Though they had dull white eyes, I could see a ravenous hunger for living flesh gleam through. There were too many of them for us to handle. Back when I lived in Neverwinter, I had fought the undead before. I knew how they could overwhelm and devour a person quickly. We needed time to destroy them individually if we could. So, I ran to the center of the room, leapt up onto the table, and held my mace into the air. There wasn't a fancy prayer for what I did, but it was more of an emotion. I allowed the light of the Master's spark to run through me and expel a holy light across the room. The long dormant vocal cords of those undead cultists rattled and grated, producing moans of fear as some of them, in their primal minds of hunger and survival, had enough understanding to know that something more powerful and divine had looked upon them momentarily. Their response was to turn and flee, while others lumbered forward, determined to sink their rotted remains for teeth into our flesh. 3 fled, while 3 remained. We fended them off, my mace crushing in the skull of one, rendering immobile. Althrot and Gunnar had set another aflame with their magics, and Cassius and Lass wore the other one down. I watched with satisfaction as Cassius's 2-handed hammer broke the spine of the husk, sending it in a heap against the wall. A shout for them to be ready, that the others would come back soon. The Lass and I stood on the either side of the door, while Cassius waited back with Gunnar and Althrot. We made quick work of the others before they knew exactly what was happening. I wish I could say that I took the remains, laid them out, and said a prayer for their souls to find some sort of peace. But I didn't do anything of the sort. From the things we had seen so far, these cultists deserved unrest for eternity for the atrocities that they had committed. For I was sure there was more than I'd ever know. Things that I couldn't have imagined, things that I didn't want to imagine. The chanting became apparent as we moved down the hall, one phrase repeated over and over, a phrase that hounded us throughout our survival, if you call it that, in Barovia. He is the ancient, he is the land. We moved down the hall into a massive room. It was almost like a cathedral. The earthen stairs were smoother here, as if the crafters took care. The floor was much lower, giving the whole room a cavernous feel. There were skeletons shackled to the walls that ran the length of the room, and from the low light I could see that they were covered in mold, and any skin that had been there had been picked away long ago. And the chant continued, "He is the ancient, he is the land." The room was empty, but the floor was bare and worn with high traffic of cultists that knelt in front of the focus of the room. It was a statue. I could see that it was a wooden painted statue that towered over us when we approached it. It was a male figure with gaunt features and a pale face. The wood meticulously carved to give him a massive black cloak. His long pale fingers of his right hand rested on the head of a dark wolf. The other left hand held out a smoky gray crystal orb. He is the ancient. He is the land. None of us recognized the figure towering before us, but the evil radiating off the statue was enough to tell me that if I had ever met this man, I would have remembered. There was something foul in the look that they had carved into his face. It took everything in me not to take up my mace and destroy the statue right then and there. But I stayed my hand, for I didn't know what dark magics were cast upon the statue. This man, Cassius whispered, was made of nothing good. He is the ancient. He is the land. There was an exit near the statue that we took. I vowed that if I were to ever meet this man, I would do everything to make sure that his evil was stopped. No matter if it took the rest of my life, someone that promoted the death of children wasn't worth keeping around. The hall didn't narrow anymore, and it was expansive. At the end was a wooden door with a visage of an upside-down windmill, as if they installed the door incorrectly. When we pushed the door open, we saw a large frame bed, an earthen fireplace, and warped furniture. It was a room that spoke of prominence. Some kind of twisted prominence. A picture was above the fireplace, It hung on the wall of two people, but someone had taken black and red paint and smeared over the faces. We surmised that this must have been the cult leader's room. I was about to say something when there was a deep gasp from the corner. A door that we did not see until then silently swung inward, and stepped a figure that was dressed in what once was an elegant ball gown of crimson and black. Now the colors had faded, and there was dirt and cobwebs. The wearer's skin was once flush with life had gone ash gray, where muscles wrapped around bone had become atrophied and twisted. The long, elegant face that had held so many emotions now was twisted into a black teeth rage. Her eyes, still eerily, held their green color, but whatever kindness might have been there was gone. "I didn't know I'd have such petulant guests," she said, touching her ragged hair. Behind us from the other room came, "He is the ancient. He is the land." I know I should have talked to her, given us some time to learn some things from this woman of what happened. But there was too much anger welling in me. How dare she pretend that we invaded her privacy in a bastardized version of her bedroom in the manor above? How dare she, the woman who had eaten humans, including children, pretend that she was worthy of any conversation? "Elizabeth Durst!" I shouted, prepared to give my condemning speech, but Cassius ran past me, tired of this game, and swung his hammer. She roared and fought against his attacks. Her own screech sent cold chills up my spine, but not because I feared what she could do, but because after the scream, behind us, we could hear the moans of the other undead cultists lumbering toward us. We fought against them, Gunnar and Othroth burning up one, and I exploding the chest of another through a sacred flame of the All-Father. Cassius had turned his attention to another cultist and had just pinned it to the wall. Elizabeth, seeing the opening, dove toward him to sink her teeth into his flesh, but the lass was there in a flash. With precision, she rammed an open palm into the bottom of Elizabeth's jaw, sending rotten teeth flying out of her mouth. When she fell back, her jaw hanging loose, she started another attack, but the lass swept her legs out from under her, and Cassius finished the job by bringing down his hammer. Her face collapsed inward, and then her skull blossomed out across the hardened dirt floor. The unnatural life of Elizabeth Durst had finally ended. "Do you think this is the monster the children spoke of?" Othroth asked. "I don't think so," Gunnar replied. "Listen to the chanting behind us." "He is the ancient. He is the land." I took her body and put it on the bed. Once she was a mother, and I believed that she felt love. That maybe somewhere there was a part of her soul that was still salvageable. I don't know why I did it, but I hoped that, once this was over, I could restore some sort of peace over her soul, to quieten the restlessness of the thing that was Elizabeth Durst. Pure evil? Pure good? What does it look like? Is that, beyond saints and gods, even an achievable thing? As a cleric of Maradon, I try to do the best thing, but I'm a mortal, driven by emotions. I've lived multiple human lifetimes, but still, my scope is narrow compared to the almighties that rule above us. I cannot promise anyone that I'll always commit good acts. I'm flawed. I awake flawed, and standing there looking at Elizabeth Durst's corpse, I tried to force myself to feel sympathy for her, to be a better dwarf. And that's all I could do. Maybe when the scales of judgment were weighed, my actions would be taken into consideration. We looked around the room for any more clues as to what started this, or who was that statue out there that the chanting was coming from. We found nothing. Instead, there were candles and torches that were once used to move through the dark caverns, but they had been discarded as an afterthought, for the things that moved through the halls of this cavern found no warmth or comfort that flame could give. The earthly delights had no meaning to anything down here anymore. The only driving want to destroy and consume all life seemed to drive these things. That's when we found a small document written in neat handwriting. It looked to be written in Elizabeth's hand. It was a half-written letter to a dark ancient one, asking him to look upon their acts and finally pay them a visit. It begged and pleaded that he look upon her dark deeds and bless her and her cult with the dark gifts that he had been known to give those others that had pleased him. She mentioned the transformation of Walter, but something happened where the letter stopped. We wondered aloud to one another who this lord was, but again none of us could surmise any name. This unnamed character seemed to hold a great place in those that sought evil. I patted Lancelot as he whimpered at my side to reassure him that there was nothing that we couldn't do. We left the way we came back into the massive room with the statue. He is the ancient. He is the land. Again and again and again. We found another entrance that led to a spiral staircase in the hall with pedestals that held different items and a door on the other end. As we walked down the middle of the room, I took inventory of all the items that were displayed. A mummified hand floating in a jar of green liquid, a dagger with the hilt made from a skull of a rat, a small mummified figure, an iron pendant that had been destroyed beyond recognition, and a leather cloak. When we looked at it a little longer, we realized that the cloak was made of patches of human skin. The purpose of these things, we found, were for ritual. We were only able to surmise this after we forced open the massive iron door at the end of the room. It was a room larger than the cathedral that we had just left. It had stone stairs that led to a blood-stained pedestal atop in the center of the room. Behind us the chanting had stopped, and we were left with the distant howl of the wind. This was the ritual room. This is where the foul deeds happened. The things behind us were brought into this room, and things were committed upon the stone and casting spells and human sacrifices. We entered the room one at a time with our weapons drawn. The sound in the room echoed against the walls, each move amplified by the acoustics that had seemed purposely made. In the far wall we could see an indentation with what looked like a pile of mud and leaves larger than any man and bone. The very air was heavy with death and fear. Arthurot stuck close to me as we walked to the length of the room. There was a shout and a grinding noise, and we turned to see Gunnar trying in vain to force the door open that had closed, locking us in. There were shackles lining the walls with piles of bones below them. The same shackles were mounted to the altar in the center of the room. There were marks on the concrete suggesting that limbs and heads were severed with blunt-edged weapons. There were faces of ghouls carved into the altar with their mouths open. It looked to me that they were ready to take in the blood from their victims. But we didn't have much time to expect much else. For the voices that had chanted, "He is the ancient, he is the land," took up a new line. "One must die." We looked at one another in shock, realizing that to open the door and get out of this room, one of us had to die. I looked at the scared Arthurot. One must die. To a nervous Gunnar, one must die. To the cold face of Cassius, one must die. And to the reserved face of Las, one must die. We tried to force the door open, shouted at the top for the voices to stop, struck the walls with our weapons, and did everything in our power to find some escape. One must die. "Don't want to do this," Cassius said. I turned and looked at him. "No," I said. "It doesn't have to be this way." I knew, as I said, there was no way around it, that this had to be done. And he repeated it. "It has to be done," he said. Later, Cassius told me he felt sick at what he did, but he did it out of necessity. Though I hated him in that moment, if I could be like him, one that could displace his emotion for reason, maybe we would be in a better place. But then I couldn't even look at him as what he was about to do, so I walked down into the water and stared at the door. One must die. Behind me I could hear him mumble some kind of words, and there was an anxious patting of Lancelot as he went toward Cassius, who offered him some food. One must die. There was a moment of silence, and then a sickening blow that produced a single wince from the dog as he sacrificed it upon the altar. The chanting stopped. I went to the altar to Lancelot's limp corpse and the blood draining out into the stone ghoul's mouth, and I took his collar and wrapped it tightly onto my wrist. Animals, especially dogs, I believe are not evil. They are good and only know survival. Lancelot was only our friend for a brief moment, but I would not forget his sacrifice. I would carry him all the way to the end if I had to. I was ignorant then, but he was the first of many innocent and kind-hearted souls that would be consumed by the evil of Barovia. I said a prayer of thanks to Lancelot and decided I was going to bury him once we got out of here. I had the idea of, once the door opened, I would take him and lay him with the bones of Rose. She would have liked him. But the door did not open. Behind us, in the piles of refuse, there was a gurgle. We all moved toward the noise and readied our weapons. The mass moved. It shivered. And there was a deep moan, as if something was in great pain. The thing that rose out of the water was something I had never seen in my entire life. I will try to explain it in the best possible way, but my faculties almost left me when this hulking beast stepped forward. It was 2 times taller than any of us, and wider than 2 men. It walked on its back feet and drug its arms behind it. It was made of thick exposed muscle and bones that ran the length of its body. There was pink swollen skin poking between the muscle fibers, making it seem that it was a creature that had been turned inside out. There were no eyes, no nose, and from what I could see, it had no mouth, until it opened it, and I could see no teeth but a fleshy maw. It roared, and it was angry and deep, but I could hear something else underneath that was small and scared. I can honestly say we did not hesitate, we did not pause, but the beast was faster. It charged forward, and Cassius struck a few blows, holding it off, but the bones proved to be good armor. It swung a meaty arm and threw him against the wall. I shouted his name as his limp form crumpled face up in the water. The lass, quick and light on her feet, jumped from the altar and laid into her attacks, but it was nothing. The monster replied by grabbing her ankle and throwing her to the ground as if she were nothing but to fly. She stumbled to her feet and tried to dodge another attack, but I could tell she was addled from hitting her head against the concrete. The next blow pushed air out of her lungs, and she gasped as she toppled down the steps unconscious. Gunnar and Otherot were pelting the monsters with spells. I had been on the other side of the room, so I began running toward them just as the beast did. Otherot shouted my name as a massive flesh monster came between us. I don't know what happened to the lad, but I knew that he was out of the fight. I rammed my shield into the back of the monster and cast Holy Light upon him. It turned, and I blocked its attack with my shield. My arm went numb, and my legs went weak. The beast gripped its hands together and brought both fists down upon me. I wanted to shout for the help of Moradon, for my friends, for anyone. But the weight of the attack slammed me onto the ground. I knew I was dying. I crawled back with my vision darkening. My last breath came out of my lungs as I watched Gunnar, picked up by the monster, and was beginning to be eaten. Then there was darkness. But not the darkness that I could imagine. It was cold and without comfort. There was no warm spark from the Allfather's hammer, nothing that I had told those that were approaching death before me. I could hear a deep laughter, and then my lungs began to burn. I rose, spewing water. I could hear the others that had fallen, coughing. I looked up to see Gunnar standing at the altar covered in blood and flesh, and in his hands there was a still body of an infant. Later, he told us what happened. The monster had swallowed him whole, and inside, at the center, he found a screaming infant writhing in pain. He could see that the monster's veins and muscles were wrapped around the small body, and it suggested to him that the monster was a child, and were one, that somehow this creature was alive and powered by the suffering of the child. Knowing his death was near, Gunnar could do nothing but cradle the child as best as he could and comfort him. That's when the monster began to shake, and the child stopped crying. The flesh and bone fell away, and he was left with only the child in his arms. He said that it opened its eyes for a moment, and to him it looked up and smiled before its body went limp and its life left for good. The monster, Walter Durst, had been slain through the sympathy of a dwarf. I realized when I breathed I could feel my lungs burn, and when I ran to Othrot, he stepped away and asked what had happened to my head. I used the water to look upon my face, and at the center of my forehead there was a burned and bleeding mark of an anvil. I'd heard saints getting stigmatas before, but I had never seen them in person. When I breathed out, I could see smoke. There was a cough that followed, and I couldn't seem to stop it. When Cassius asked me what happened, he seemed angry. He said that he only witnessed those marks in Eberron, and they weren't a stigmata, and that I shouldn't have something like that. Though I was tired, and I was broken, I knew that Moradon had extended out his hand and pressed it upon my forehead and brought me back to life. The fires of his forge were now in my chest and burned in my heart. My very soul felt as if it were aflame. He didn't seem to like this explanation, but he didn't say any more on the subject. We took our time and gathered everyone in the Durst family and placed them into their respective crypts and sealed them shut forever. I said a prayer to Moradon to lay the souls to rest between my coughing. The others stood around respectfully and waited until I had finished. I then went back to the ritual room alone to retrieve the body of Lancelot. I decided since he was a dog, he would want to be buried outside. But much to my surprise, the dog was alive and he ran to greet me. The only difference was his ribs were showing on one side where Cassius had struck him. This dog was technically not alive, but I didn't question it. I'd also laid the nursemaid rest with Walter because she deserved it. That was her child. When we left Durst Manor, the place felt quiet and finally at peace. No matter what foul things had happened there, I believed that we had finally laid them to rest. The house itself could now slowly fade into the land and be forgotten. We gathered up our tent that we had made for the ghost children, and I looked up at the house a single time before turning away. There in the window, I could see the children waving out, with Gustav behind them, his arm around Margaret, the nursemaid. Above them in the attic window, I could see Elizabeth frowning down at me. I didn't care for her, even then. Although her soul was finding rest, she still couldn't let go of the dark things she had wanted in life. But I knew if I came back to this place, which I would ensure that I would, and that this house still stood, I would find and hunt that woman down, and I would destroy her in any form. I would leave nothing left. She would not have a second chance of redemption. I raised my hand to her with a grim smile and touched the stigmata on my forehead with the other, ensuring I remembered my promise. And then we left the house in silence. The horrors we saw there would stick with us for many days after, and the things that happened to us down there with Walter, the time that we spent in the darkness alone and our deaths had changed us for more than we had known. But for that moment, we traveled on a road until we made it to massive statues on either side. They were hooded, and the dark mist clung to them. We did not know it, but we had finally set foot into the realm of Barovia. We had finally stepped into the horror that was about to come.